Excellent. Well, for everyone that wasn't in my previous lecture, that's probably a few of you, I'm Kevin Burkeland again. I just did Linux 101 where I went into just the basics of Linux. And now I'm going to be talking about distros. And this historically has been my most popular talk that I give at LinuxFest. In fact, I just need to brag for a moment. Highest viewed video on the LinuxFest Northwest YouTube channel 2 years in a row. Yeah. That's because all of the other people that are more popular film their own and post their own on their own YouTube channels. But I'm still winning. All right, so this is a talk about how to help you choose what distro is right for you, not the right distro. There is no right distro. I just want to get that out of the way first, right off and foremost. All right, disclaimer. These views do not reflect the views of BTC or LinuxFest as a whole. This is my opinion, and they are just that, opinions. And also, I have been known to be wrong about things. I ask if you are going to tell me how wrong I am. You do it in a nice way. That's all I ask. So, if you're disagreeing with my opinions, feel free to talk to me after the lecture, explain why your favorite distro should be in another category, but please don't interrupt my lecture because you think that insert distro here, Linux is the best distro. All questions must be questions. This one's important. It really helps the flow of the talk. All right. So first we need to talk about what is a distro. And simply put, a distro is a Linux operating system that a group of people, or maybe one person working very hard and alone, have decided on. This is a philosophy of how this operating system should work, and this is how I would like it to work, and we are going to continue on that idea. Every different distro has an idea that it's based around. And we're going to get into that in a little bit more detail, but let's first talk about Windows, because this is a Linux lecture, so we need to talk about Windows first. So this is Windows 1 distro. It's what you get when you get Windows. This is the idea that Windows, Microsoft as a company, has decided that this is how Windows should be, and if anyone disagrees with that, it's too bad, because this is going to be Windows. In fact, Windows 10 is going to be Windows 10 supposedly forever. I give it 3 more years before it's like Windows 10.2 or something. All right. So, next part we need to cover is what differentiates the OS from the desktop environment. So the operating system is the underlying core of the computer. It's the main portion of the computer. The desktop environment is the graphical layer, the pretty, the shiny, the things that you see. Most distributions don't make a distinction between their OS and a given desktop environment. The one big difference here is Ubuntu. All of the different desktop managers in Ubuntu are broken out into their own distros, but that's because they're also maintained by different groups of people. Ubuntu just releases Ubuntu, and then all of the other ones like Kubuntu and Edubuntu, which we'll get into later, are all released by different community groups. So, to give you guys an example, this is OpenSUSE. This is OpenSUSE running KDE. It is one of the ones that we'll be going over in just a second. You got your bar down at the bottom. You have your desktop workspaces. Your desktop folder will always stay up in the corner if you set it up to do that. You got your icons down over in the corner for setting up your networking. Everything's a little bit glassy and shiny in default KDE. And then this is the exact same operating system, the exact same version of OpenSUSE, but running the GNOME desktop environment. Or GNOME is the more proper way to say it, but it's spelled GNOME. It looks like GNOME when you read it, so I just say GNOME. This is it with the task launcher open. Otherwise, this typically is just a desktop with a top bar across the top when you're normally using it. So these are different popular desktop environments for varying definition of desktop environment. One of them, I will admit, is just a Windows manager, but we'll get into that distinction as we go. So we got GNOME, we got KDE, we got Mate. Mate, I will actually pronounce the way that they want it to be pronounced because Mate is a real thing, whereas GNOME isn't a real thing. XFCE, LXDE, and Xmonad. And Xmonad's the weird one that I threw in because Unity is no longer a thing. For those of you that were into the Ubuntu ecosystem, Unity died this last year. 17.10 was the first one that went back to GNOME. So when GNOME went from GNOME 2 to GNOME 3, Ubuntu was like, we're taking our ball and going home. And they made Unity, and they're like, this is better, right, everyone? And the answer was a resounding, eh. So then they finally have given up, and now they're back on GNOME. So this is GNOME. This is what it looks like more commonly as a desktop. GNOME is super flexible. It's the one that I primarily run. I know that's going to make people form hard and fast decisions about me. But the reason why I like GNOME personally is because it is very extendable. I can change how it works. I can change how it looks. For those of you that were in my previous talk, I had my GNOME desktop looking like Windows 10. I had my GNOME desktop looking like Mac OS. You can do pretty much anything you want with it, with theming, customization, adding extensions to it, and it's all very easy to customize for the most part, depending on what distribution is backing you up. But in its default state, you got the top bar at the top, you got a desktop with icons on it, you open up applications in the workspace. Each workspace that you open up spawns another virtual workspace, which virtual workspace are the other cool thing that Linux does, which allows you to have a virtual desktop and an actual desktop. And it looks kind of like, oh, I don't have it set up. My screens are switched. So you can move all of the stuff that's on one desktop and have it just be there, and then you hit a key combination on your keyboard, and then you have a fresh, clean desktop to work on. And it was one of the things that I really liked while working, is I would have one that was like, you know, for checking my emails and all the other stuff, and then one for actually focusing and getting work done. So I would set up my different desktops, and I would move between them based off of what I was doing. KDE is the other big desktop environment. So GNOME and KDE have been, it's for years and years and years, it was a big competition between whether or not GNOME was the most influential, or KDE was, or everyone should be using GNOME for this reason, or everyone should be using KDE for that reason. It's kind of shaken out, and now no one really cares what you're using as long as you use it to do stuff. But KDE is considered to be the more Windows-like of the two. So if you're trying to move from Windows, KDE can be a good one to move into. At least for me, KDE has always been a very glassy experience. Like, everything's designed to look kind of glassy. It's more resource intensive in my experience than GNOME, but that could just be due to the hardware that I've been running it on. That being said, there is one word of warning that I would issue about KDE, and that is that it has a bad case of Mortal Kombat syndrome. And by that, I mean that it renames everything to start with K. Like, instead of using terminal, it's console with a K. Instead of using Firefox as your web browser, it's Conqueror with a K. Instead of using calculator, it's calc with a K. It changes a lot of stuff, which is by no means bad. But it does mean that if you start with KDE, it might be harder to expand into other desktop environments in the future. I definitely recommend checking it out, though. It is nice. All right, next up is Mate, and this, I will admit, is a fairly old picture of what Mate looked like. I didn't have time to update this slide in particular to the latest version of Mate. But the nice thing about Mate is that it was a response to when GNOME went from GNOME 2, which looked very similar to this, to GNOME 3, which looks like what I just showed you guys. You can tell a lot of stuff has changed. There used to be 2 bars. The workspaces were arranged down at the bottom so you could change the virtual workspaces. You had application bar at the top with places and system information. It was a really big change when they went from GNOME 2 to GNOME 3, and Mate was a direct result of that. What they did was they said, hey, we don't like the direction you're going with this. It's changing too much for us, so we're going to make our own thing, and it's going to be great, and we'll call it Mate, and it will be fantastic. And it really was, and it was a nice continuation on from what GNOME 2 was doing, and it's still up to date, and it's still really nice, and it's about medium weight as far as desktop environments go, meaning you can run it on pretty old machines, and it runs just fine. Now this is Cinnamon. So when GNOME 2 went to GNOME 3, some people got upset about that, and they decided that they wanted to, keep it the old stylistic decisions, so they decided that they would also fork it, and they would create Cinnamon. Because, GNOME 2 was a very different operating system than GNOME 3. I'm repeating myself. So Mate and Cinnamon were both created for the exact same reason at the exact same time by 2 separate groups of people, which is both at the same time really cool and shows like the flexibility of the Linux community, and also, in my opinion, a huge waste of energy. Just like they're both working for the same reason towards the same goal with different ideas about it. But Cinnamon was created by the Linux Mint community to give themselves a more GNOME 2 feeling desktop environment. They've diverged quite a bit since then, but in their original incarnations, they were almost the exact same desktop environments, just both of them being direct forks of GNOME 2's code and created this. That being said, I do like Cinnamon a little bit better. I feel as though it's a little bit more refined and polished. Once again, opinions, yell at me online. But yeah, it's also in that medium weight category of desktop environments. It can still run on, fairly old systems, and it still works fairly well on new systems. So I like it. It's also very Windowsy feeling, at least in its layout and orientation, so it's not a huge jump or leap to get into this one. Next up is XFCE. XFCE was actually is still the one that I run most often if I have to use a system for work. It is incredibly lightweight. There's not a whole lot of polish and shine to it. There's like very little transitions. When you open menus, things just kind of appear on the screen. But it is incredibly lightweight of a desktop environment that just kind of gets out of your way and lets you get work done. And that's always been my main interest in a desktop environment. Is it's cool, it allows me to move my mouse around and click on things, but for the most part, I want it to get out of my way and let me do my work, because I mostly worked in the command line. XFCE is an interesting project. For a while, people thought it was dead because it hadn't had a new release in like 4 years. And then all of a sudden, there was just a new release one day, and everyone's like, oh, I guess this project isn't dead. And that's one of the cool things about the Linux community as well, is that even if it doesn't seem like somebody's working on it, there's probably at least a few people still working and striving to make this old thing seem new. And since then, there have been more regular releases and more regular updates, and I really like it. If you are more familiar with the Mac layout of things, it's kind of a bit more along those lines. I've never really been a Mac guy, so I don't know why I've gravitated towards XFCE, except that every work system that I've owned, at some point I've broken its graphics card communication to the point where this is the only thing that will run on it. And I didn't have time to fix it because I was busy putting out other fires. So that's my pitch for XFCE. It works great when there's no other choices. Then there's LXDE. LXDE is kind of more of a Windows XP feeling one to me because of the glossy bar at the bottom and the overall layout. It is a similar idea to XFCE in a super lightweight desktop environment sense. It still gives you all the bells and whistles of a nice desktop environment, but you can see right here we got a start menu, we got a quick launch bar, we got, you know, networking and other charms down over at the side. Desktop is standard. It's a really nice one. It's, if you have an older system that you want to put something on and you are hankering for those Windows XP days, LXDE, that's a really nice solid choice. And then the last one I'm going to add in, this is not technically a desktop environment, it's just a Windows manager. But this is one that I've on and off again have messed around with switching over to my primary way of interfacing with my computer. And the idea behind this is that it's a new way of interacting with your computer. The mouse is not involved at all. It's entirely keyboard driven, and every time you open up a new application, it creates a new tile. So this could be my Firefox, and this could be my terminal, and this could be something else, and that could be something else. And then I can rotate through them with key commands and make one of them the larger one and rotate through all of them, and just every time it opens up, there's just a new tile added. It's really, really, really cool if you learn all the key commands. I have not bothered to learn all the key commands, which is why every time I switch over to it, I last about 2 hours, get frustrated, and go back to my old desktop environment. But I figured I should throw it in case somebody really likes a challenge as far as desktop environments. It's a great thing to mess around with for an afternoon, and you can have all of these installed on the same system and change through them like once an hour if you wanted to. You just gotta log out, change what option you have selected, and log back in, and you can completely change how your operating system looks and feels. So the main takeaway, oh, what's up?
Does that depend on what login manager you have installed?
Sometimes, well, yeah, but most modern login managers, like, as long as you're not running Xmonad as your login manager, it's a very easy task.
Oh, okay.
Yep. The big takeaway is all of those can run on any distro. They can run on Fedora, they can run on OpenSUSE, they can run on any of these things that we're covering. You could run them on TinyCore, but it kind of defeats the point. All of these work for anything that you want. So don't let how the operating system looks affect what you decide to be your operating system. More important is how they interact with updates and how they interact with the packages on the system and what you're trying to get out of your operating system. So just because one's pretty and shiny doesn't mean that it's the one that you have to choose. You can make any of these pretty and shiny if you work hard enough.
I have a question, because you were talking about them changing to version 3 and people didn't like it forking. But since you're not forced to upgrade to another version, why wouldn't everybody just stay with version 2?
So you aren't forced to upgrade to a new version, but when the GNOME team decided to move on from GNOME 2 to GNOME 3, they stopped doing security updates and stopped supporting the old version. So when the old version stopped being supported, then it would start to become a security hazard if you had it on your system. So somebody else had to take over it, and one of the few things about GNOME or GNOME as a brand is that even it's still a company. It's still a group of people working together, and this is GNOME, and other people creating something saying it's GNOME is not okay.
Okay, so I guess the question is, though, if it's the desktop environment, the security issues are relative to the desktop, not the operating system?
The security issues in every operating system that you have ever run are a combination of the operating system and the programs running on it. And if the programs running on it are less secure, then you will be less secure as a result. To give you a real world example of that, I think it was Ubuntu, I want to say 15.10, there was an issue with it when it first launched that if you held down the enter key, it would log you in as whatever user you were on. Huge security problem with the desktop environment. You just held it down, it like overflowed the amount of failures that it could do, and then it just immediately let you in. What's up?
So does that mean that insecure desktop environment is basically a backdoor into your system?
Yes,
Okay.
100%. So make sure you do your updates regularly. That's one of the first things that I teach my students in our classes is, in fact, in Linux, updates aren't the chore that they are in Windows. Half the time you don't even have to reboot them. It's just, you run your updates every morning when you log into your system, and you're good to go, and you're secure, and it updates everything. It's beautiful. All right, so let's get into talking about actual distros now. So these are some questions that I ask myself when I'm trying to figure out whether or not a distro is right for me. And I encourage you to do the same thing to yourself. What am I using Linux for? For me, the longest time it was because I needed it for work. That was my gateway into Linux. Is I got a job I was totally unqualified for to be the first Linux admin for a startup, and I had to learn everything on the fly, and I was deer in the headlights, and I was just using Linux. Went home, wiped every computer that I had Windows on it, installed Linux on it, and just total immersion to try and get myself up to speed. But I was always using it for work. It wasn't until later that I started using it for fun and started playing around with other distros. How long does it need to last? One of the big things that comes up with different distros is what their update cycle looks like. And we'll get into that for each individual ones, but there's certain ones that they update every 6 months, and you can only be one version behind, and if you ever get to 2 versions behind, you no longer get security updates, and you're running an old, insecure version of it. So that might not be good for somebody that can't stand change, and they want something that's going to last 7 years before they have to do a version update on it, or 12 years. How much can I deal with change? That's another one. Not just change of the version, but change of the packages. Certain distros are what are called rolling releases, where they try and update everything exactly as it happens, and they don't even have versions. Everything's just always up to date, but it can lead to broken packages sometimes. What kind of hardware am I running? This is for people that are running older systems, or you have this old laptop that's been sitting under your bed, and now you want to try messing around with Linux because you spent the last 2 days at some weird conference, and now you're here and you're like, well, I should get something out of this, so yeah, maybe it's an old system. Philosophy of freedom, that's a big thing for a lot of people here, and I'm going to do my best to explain it, but please don't hate me when we get there, for those of you that are super opinionated about these things. Do I need it for my job? Is this something that I need to get done right now, and can I bother with messing around with some weird package manager that I've never heard of? And do I have a special task in mind? That's the new one for this year. And we'll get to that when we get to that. So these are my recommendations of Linux distros for people new to Linux. So that if this is your first LinuxFest, or maybe you've been once or twice before but have never really mustered up the courage to try it, these are the ones that I would recommend if you want to try something out as maybe like a daily driver or something to put on a laptop that you have at home. And the first one that I'm going to recommend is always controversial, but Ubuntu 16.04 LTS is still, so 18.04 came out 2 days ago, which is the new LTS. LTS stands for long-term support, meaning that with Ubuntu 16.04, I believe it was a 7-year timeline before you had to update off of it, meaning that you can still go 3 more years from now, you can still go 5 more years from now running 16.04, and it will still work. It will still get updates, it will still be patched, everything will be kept up to date, you will be secure, but your entire operating system won't change that much. The reason why I recommend waiting 3 months before going to 18.04 is even with long-term support distros, which are supposed to be like really stable, there can sometimes be growing pains and learning pains when the new one first comes out, and you don't want to be the person as a new learner that gets hit with that growing pain or that learning pain. So I'd say stick with 16.04 for now. Maybe in 3 months give 18.04 a try. But they're really cool. They're really, really stable. And the main reason that I recommend Ubuntu first and foremost is because this is the one that for some reason Silicon Valley has decided that everyone should use, and that means that there's a lot of people that don't know a lot about Linux but do like to help out other people, and they're learning and they're getting through stuff and they're making blog posts. So anytime you run into an issue in Ubuntu, chances are somebody else has run into that issue 10,000 times before you, and at least one of them has made a blog post about it, and there is a walkthrough with, okay, so you do this, and then you do this, and then you do this, and now it's fixed. So that's why I recommend Ubuntu.
Why is it 04 and not like 01 or something?
Oh, okay. So this is cool. Ubuntu version numbers their systems based off of the year of release and the month of release. The first number is the year, the second number is the month, and they do 2 releases a year. The first one is in April, so that's why it came out 2 days ago for 1804. And the second one is in October, so that's why you get your .04s and .10s. Every 2 years, they release a new LTS. All of the interim ones are latest and greatest software. They're made to be nicer, shinier. They're more for the Linux enthusiasts. LTS is where I recommend most of you guys stay if you want a stable desktop experience. All right, so the next one I'm going to recommend is Pop! OS. Pop! OS is a new distro. It is exceedingly new, as in came out in the last, I think, calendar year. Like, it came out in 2018, I'm pretty sure. It might have been late 2017. It is from System 76, which mostly make hardware. But they have created their own Linux distro. It is based off of Ubuntu, so you get all of that nice, easily Googleable stuff. But they do a little bit more work into cleaning up details around the edges. I personally like the way it looks better out of the box, but once again, you can change that however you want once you learn enough about it. But for the most part, Pop! OS is just another nice, user-friendly distribution.
Do they have support for ARM?
I don't know that off the top of my head. I'm sure their website could tell you.
Okay.
Yep. Next up is Linux Mint. Linux Mint, I catch a lot of flack for saying that I'm personally not the biggest fan of Linux Mint. This is the easiest distro to learn off of. Linux Mint is the one, if you are moving from Windows to Linux and you want an easy time of it, you should use Linux Mint. That being said, sometimes people get stuck in Linux Mint and never go out and experience anything else Linux has to offer. It is a very nice distribution. Some would say this is how computing should be. I'm a tinkerer at heart, so I personally think everyone should start messing around with their distribution a little bit more. And just, you know, it's fine to come back to Linux Mint. If you use Linux Mint and you try something else and I don't like that as much and I want to move back to Linux Mint, that is totally cool. But try something else, just for me, It's really cool, it's really nice, it's super user-friendly, it's stable, it's rock solid. One of the big differentiating factors about Linux Mint when it first came out was that it was not based in the United States, so they could include what are called non-free drivers with the operating system out of the box without you having to agree to it. So this is back in the day when Linux really had trouble with Flash and MP3s and that sort of thing, and Linux Mint just worked. And that's where it really cemented its title as the easy starter Linux distro. But I don't really have much to say beyond that it's easy and it's nice. And I don't like it because I want my life to be a little bit harder sometimes. And last but not least, for easy to use OS is Elementary OS. Elementary OS is a new distribution as of a couple of years ago, and the idea behind it was that it was created design focused. They're actually rewriting large parts of the operating system to be more design focused, meaning that this is the one exception to my rule about all of the distros. Like, you can still install the desktop environment that they use for Elementary OS on other distros, but the entire purpose and focus of Elementary OS is on design and changing how users interact with the Linux operating system through their design. To that extent, some command line functions that normally work in typical Linux distributions do not work the same way. They really want you to use the graphical user interface to make customization and tweaks to your operating system. If you're just going to be using this as a normal computer, meaning you go to a couple of websites, you print out some recipes, you know, use it like a computer instead of like a development tool, Elementary OS is a great choice, and it's pretty, and it's stable, and it's great right out the box. If you are a tinkerer like me, it might not be the best choice, but it still works, and I figure I should add it because this is one of the really interesting things in the Linux community is none of the rules are set in stone. That whole desktop environments prettiness thing, this is the exception that proves the rule, I guess. All right, now let's get into Linux for Work. This is what was important to me for the longest time. So my first recommendation for Linux for Work is OpenSUSE Leap 42.3. This is my preferred distribution that I use at home. I use it, well, I currently have Fedora on my laptop. I'll explain that when I get to the Fedora slide. But I typically run it on my laptop. And the reason why I like it and the reason why I use it is because it is designed for system administrators and programmers and builders first. Meaning that a lot of the stuff about it is focused on making certain weird administrative tasks easier. To give you an example, has anyone ever joined a Windows computer to a Windows domain? A couple of people maybe? Has anyone ever tried to join a Linux computer to a Windows domain? We got a couple. In Leap, I managed to do it in about 15 seconds after I loaded my operating system up. We have a computer running here on campus that is OpenSUSE Leap 42.3 that is joined to the Windows domain and then uses the Windows domain administrator privileges to grant sudo access on that server. Meaning if somebody is a domain administrator on the Windows domain, they can SSH in with their Windows credentials and then run sudo commands, super user commands from that. It's geeky how cool I find that, but it's really nice and I really like it, and that really cemented Leap as my personal choice of Linux for Work. Now this isn't what I always run as servers. Typically you don't get your choice of what you're going to run as a server at your work environment, but we'll get to that when we get to servers. This is what I would use if I went into a job right now and they said, okay, set up your own workstation, what do you want to run on? This is what I would pick. Also in the running is Fedora Workstation 27. This is actually my current desktop right now. In fact, this is a screenshot off of my desktop from yesterday when I was making these slides. And Fedora 27, Fedora 25 changed how I feel about Fedora. I used to hate Fedora with a blind fury, mostly because when I was a student at this school years ago, it was the only thing we were allowed to use, and it was a way out-of-date version of Fedora. And it sucked, and I hated it, and I kind of held it against Fedora for years. Fedora 25, I gave it another shot, and Fedora 25 really impressed me. It's still not my favorite distribution. There's still weird design choices, and the fact that I have to update it twice a year in order to stay current. Fedora is the one that if you can only ever be one version level behind. So last year, this slide read Fedora 25. If I was still running Fedora 25, my computer would be insecure. I like it a lot. It's really cool what you can do with it. I've been able to do cool, nerdy stuff like set it up so that when I play a video game on it, it uses my dedicated GPU in the laptop, but everything else just runs off the Intel GPU, saving me battery life on it. But I'm not entirely convinced that you need to update quite that often. It's a lot of work. So this is one of those ones, if you don't like change a lot, steer away from Fedora. But if you like tinkering with stuff, Fedora is fine. There's also Debian. Debian 9 is the current main version of Debian. Debian is a really nice operating system. It's what Ubuntu is based off of, and what Linux Mint, which is based off of Ubuntu, and Pop! OS, which is based off of Ubuntu, and all of those other things that are based off of Ubuntu. This is the precursor distribution that spawned them all. And Debian is nice for work because it is stable. It is rock solid nowadays. It didn't always used to be the case, but nowadays Debian is rock solid and stable, and it's a great thing to run if you want to run a operating system you never really have to think about. It uses apt as its package manager, so if you're coming from an Ubuntu system, it still makes sense. The one thing I would say that's weird about Debian that I need to bring up is this logo right here. For those of you that are watching online, it's the one underneath the Firefox logo. Does anyone know what that logo is off the top of their head?
Iceweasel.
Yeah, Iceweasel, or it could be IceCat. IceCat is the GNU release of Iceweasel. Both of those are solutions to a problem that, for me, highlights some of the absurdity in the free as in freedom camp that we're going to get into later. But basically, the only thing that are copyrighted about Firefox is the name and the logo. So, for Debian, in order for it to comply with the philosophy that Debian is inspired by, the free software movement, they have to, every time Firefox is released, change the logo and change the name and then re-release it.
Actually, trademark issue, not copyright.
Trademark, sorry.
Sorry.
That's also not a question. All right. So, I understand that side of the issue. Personally, I think it's a little silly. I get where they're coming from, though. I'm going to get destroyed online for that, but we'll move on past it. Debian is really solid, really good. You just run into every so often there's that weird issue where a program like Firefox you won't be able to get, and you'll have to Google, like, what is the GNU version of Firefox? Or probably DuckDuckGo if you're that far down the freedom rabbit hole. Red Hat 7 is a honorable mention on this list for Linux for Work, and I say that because if somebody is willing to pay for a copy of Red Hat, or I guess SUSE instead of OpenSUSE for you, run that. If the company is willing to pay for a paid for Linux version, definitely run that, because nothing makes Linux easier to run or to learn than having somebody else fix your problems for you.
If it's open source, then why should you need to pay for it?
We will get into that. Do not worry. So, Linux for old computers. These are some suggestions. Maybe you have a computer that's been sitting in your garage for the past 10 years, or maybe even 15 years. These are things that will probably run on it. They're not pretty, they're not, lightning fast, but they are able to run on just about anything, no matter what constraints or limitations you have. So the first one is Puppy Linux. Puppy Linux is a Linux distribution that runs entirely off of a thumb drive. You plug the thumb drive into the computer, you boot off the thumb drive, it saves everything that you do on it to that thumb drive. Your entire hard drive for your operating system is a thumb drive. So you can take your entire computer system with you on your keys if you want. It's super lightweight, super low resources, really cool. What's up?
How simple is it to use?
Fairly, I'd say. It's not complicated. It's definitely fairly straightforward. But yeah, Puppy Linux. I know a lot of people really love Puppy, and who wouldn't? Because its logo is a puppy, and it's called Puppy Linux. And then also TinyCore. TinyCore I've mentioned a couple of times today already, but that's because I'm just always blown away by the fact that it exists. The entirety of this operating system is 12 megabytes. That's the entire size commitment that you have to make on your hard drive for it. And I think it only needs 128 megabytes of RAM to run. So if you have an old system, give it a shot. I mean, worst case scenario, you can't get it to install. Best case scenario, you got a really cool conversation piece for your nerdy friends. But yeah, tiny core, super small, super lightweight. I recommend it. So these are Linux that feel like work. Not really. They're hobbyist Linux, and every time I do this set, people get sad because I pick on Arch. But I've added a new one that I'm going to pick onto it this year, and that's OpenSUSE and Tumbleweed, because Tumbleweed burned me. It used to be on my list of ones that I would recommend for new people, because I had never run into an issue with it, but apparently I was not using it enough. Tumbleweed breaks sometimes, and when it breaks, it does not break easy. It breaks hard. Now, you can roll back to previous versions, which makes it probably the easiest of these ones that I'm going to be covering to use. Also, it has a proper installer, unlike the rest of the ones that we're going to be talking about here, meaning you can put a disk in and it will install the operating system for you. But Tumbleweed is now firmly in the hobbyist camp for me, because I got burned once, and I will always remember it. So next up is Arch Linux. Arch Linux itself is actually very usable and easy to use, kind of like OpenSUSE. The main issue with Arch Linux comes from the fact that the installation process is a nightmare. You have you get a disk that will mount a live command line version of your operating system, meaning you can type into the command line. From that point on, you are responsible for formatting your hard drive, moving the files into the correct spots. There are easier to use like Arch forks that add an installer and make everything easier for you. But Arch by itself, you kind of have to follow through a wiki and get everything set up properly, and it's a whole pain. There's no easy installer for it. To that end, I will say Arch is a fine distribution once you start using it, but why can't you just make an installer? Why you gotta be this way, Arch? Why you gotta be this exclusive club? Alright, next up is Gen 2 Linux. Gen 2 Linux actually kind of became a joke on the internet. If you were online in like the 2010s, and you were posting on a forum and you're like, my Windows system is having trouble, invariably there would be one guy, one smart ass that would post, install Gen 2 as the solution. And that's because Gen 2 is a nightmare to install. On paper, it's a really cool idea for an operating system. So Gen 2 Linux, by default, will compile everything that you want to install for it for that computer itself, which sounds really cool. It will make it so that everything is built specifically for the hardware that you're running. The problem is that A, it doesn't have an installer, just like Arch, and B, you have to compile everything every time you want to install something, which means that a lot of stuff breaks while you're trying to install it. And you'll be like, I want to install thing, and then it's like, okay, well, to install thing, you need to install other thing. And who here has seen that scene from Malcolm in the Middle where Hal is trying to fix a light in the kitchen, and then one of the drawers is squeaky, so he goes to get a screwdriver, but something else breaks, and then he eventually ends up underneath his car trying to change the oil so he can go get WD-40 so that he can fix all this other stuff, and the wife comes home and says, hey, the light's out in the kitchen, and he comes out from underneath the car and says, what does it look like I'm trying to fix? That is Gen 2 Linux in my experience. Like 3 days later, I'm finally able to do the thing that I started on. So Gen 2, it's a great experience, a learning experience. If you like to throw yourself into the deep end, give it a shot, but it's a pain. And then this last one is Linux from scratch, which last year somebody pointed out that my demo slide of it has errors in the actual photo that I was able to find of Linux from scratch. But Linux from scratch is not so much of a distro as it is a book. It's a freely distributed book online that walks you from compiling your own kernel to having your own desktop operating system in probably about 6 months to a year. Every summer I tell myself, I'm going to work on Linux from scratch. This is the year. I'm going to build it myself. And every year I get to summer and I'm like, Not this year. That being said, I keep it open as a offer to my students that if they can show me that they built Linux from scratch, I'll give them extra credit in one of the Linux classes that they have with me. So far no one's taken me up on it, but I'm looking forward to the day.
I'm going to take your class.
May I ask a question?
Oh yeah.
If you've gone with one of these, say Ubuntu or something like that, and you decide later you would like to use a different desktop manager, can you try another one?
Oh yeah, you can have. I have like 6 installed on this system right now. I have Gnome, KDE, XFCE, Xmonad, and then a couple other ones.
So you can try them and then and just kind of access all the files and stuff like that.
And all I have to do to change them is all I have to do is log out of this, and then when I log back in, there's a little gear that I can click on, and it has a drop-down list, and it says, hey, do you want to log into KDE now? And it works great.
Right.
So this is my recommendations for Linux for Server. I'm going to blow through this a little quick because honestly, servers aren't fun to look at. But if you are building a server, CentOS makes a great server infrastructure if you are going to be running it against like a Red Hat production environment, or if it's a mixed system, or if you're using Fedora. CentOS is the free version of Red Hat, and this is where I'm going to get into answering your question of why you would pay for Red Hat versus have or use it for free. When you pay for Red Hat, you're not paying for Red Hat, you're paying for the support license that comes with it, meaning that if something goes wrong on my server, instead of spending the next, half hour to 3 days trying to beat my head against it, I can pick up a phone and say, hey, something's broken, you should fix this.
Okay.
And that's why you pay for Red Hat. Bigger companies will do that. I've never worked at one that would pay for anything. I've had to do it myself every time. But if somebody will pay for Red Hat or SUSE or any of the other main ones, then definitely take them up on the offer. Just don't pay for them yourselves. They're expensive. Except for SUSE on the Pi. SUSE on the Pi is only like $30. So if you have a Raspberry Pi and want to run an enterprise class Linux server on it, why? But you can for cheap. Fedora Server is another one that I would recommend. Fedora Server I would only recommend it if you are really okay with change and really want to stay on the bleeding edge of stuff. If you're doing like really weird, well, okay, they're going to yell at me again. Leading edge. Fedora once contacted me after I gave this lecture and said, we're not a bleeding edge distro, we're a leading edge distro, which I totally understand, but semantics. Basically, the difference is bleeding edge breaks every day, and leading edge breaks maybe once a year. So Fedora Server is really nice. They have a graphical sort of thing that you can do, like you can browse to the server through a web browser and do some configuration on it, which is kind of nice, but I wasn't able to find any photos of that, so you gotta stare at this command line. Ubuntu Server 1604 is a honorable mention because this is the one, once again, Silicon Valley has decided that they're going to run all of their servers off of Ubuntu systems, and the cloud really seems to be kind of geared and built around Ubuntu systems due to that, meaning that this is one of the most Googleable ones if something's going wrong for you. If you're trying to like get an Apache web server set up and it's not working right, you can type in something error code Ubuntu 1604 and you will find a walkthrough dedicated to your distro. It makes it easier. Personally, it was my first one, and I don't think I would be standing here in front of you if it hadn't been the server that I had to learn how to use for that startup that I wasn't qualified to work at. That being said, there are better things once you get out of the Ubuntu sphere. And then SLES, SUSE Enterprise Linux Server, is the other one that I would recommend. And this one I recommend because of this thing that I'm showing you right here. This is YAST. YAST is a way of doing graphical user work through the command line, and it is awesome. You know that server that I was telling you about that I joined to the Windows domain in about 15 seconds? Did I forget to mention that it didn't have a graphical user interface on it? It was all via command line using this. Basically, it's just super, super, super nice to use. So, I'm running a bit long, so I'm going to speed through this. GNU Linux as a philosophy. So GNU Linux as a philosophy, Linux often refers to the operating system, but as Linux gets its name from the Linux kernel. Linux kernel translates between the hardware and software layer. GNU makes up about 8 to 13% of a Linux distribution. GNU stands for GNU not Unix. GNU is strictly more the OS than the Linux kernel is, and it's free as in freedom, not free as in free beer. We've already kind of covered that in the Linux 101 talk. For those of you that weren't here for that one, please check it out. It should be on YouTube already. But the basic idea is that your freedoms are encroached upon whether you know it or not if you use non-free software. The software's freedom is very important. It means that you can live with more liberty in your life, that you can go and modify how something works if you want to. To that extent, there are some Linux distributions that will not allow you to install non-free software. And in honor of Richard Stallman, who is the biggest proponent of this whole GNU ideology, we're going to take a look at Triskel Linux, or Triskel GNU/Linux. This is a fully GNU endorsed operating system. Debian is not GNU enough for them to be accepted, even though they do the whole Iceweasel thing. But Triskel is, because Triskel will not, unless you go in and modify the operating system, allow you to install non-free packages. This operating system actively protects your freedoms in the GNU sense of freedoms. All right, Linux for special cases and one BSD. So first special case, this one I've added because every year I get questions about it. This is probably one of the most famous Linux distros because it's the one that was used by Edward Snowden. Basically, the purpose of Tails Linux is security. It is a security-based distro. It also runs off of a thumb drive, meaning you could plug it in anywhere. It used to have a button, I couldn't confirm if it still does, that would make it look like a Windows XP desktop when you clicked a button on it. So you could hide what you're doing and make it look like you were on Windows. And by default, it has all sorts of additional features for security put on it. That being said, when you start adding more security features to your web browsers and other things, it starts getting less usable. One of the big things that it does is it blocks JavaScript on all pages that you go to. Meaning that if you want to purchase something off of Amazon, you're going to have a heck of a time because all modern websites use a lot of JavaScript. So it's protecting your security, but at the cost of being able to use your computer. All right. So next up is the BSD system that I want to talk about. It's called pfSense. pfSense is a router operating system. Well, it's technically a firewall, but you can use it as a router as well. And it is, the reason why I wanted to bring it up is to give a shout out to our LinuxFest Northwest networking team. They built this entire network that we've all been using. They're all students here in the CNET program, and this is the router that we are all currently running off of for this event. It's also the router that we run off of for the IT program at school. So students built this, the network. I know we've had some Wi-Fi issues this weekend, but for the most part, everything that you've been able to connect to the internet on is all thanks to the hard work of a group of students that have been learning how to use this distribution. It's running off of one old desktop that we found in a closet. So don't use this next one. I'm just going to come out there and say it. This next one, do not use it unless you have a good reason. Seriously. Do not use this Linux distribution. There's very few reasons that you would have a reason that is legitimate to use this Linux distribution. seriously, unless you have a very, very, very good reason and you already know Linux very well, don't use it. Don't. And if you say, yeah, I already know a lot about Linux, why are you here? You don't use this. All right, Kali Linux is a penetration testing distribution, meaning it is tools for hacking into other people's computers or your own computers. Now, the problem with Kali Linux is, one, it's super cool. Look at that dragon. Everyone wants to use it. The other problem is, if you click around and start doing things without knowing what you're doing with it, there is a very good chance that the FBI will show up at your house and you will be spending some time in prison. So don't use it unless you have a reason. Kali Linux got very popular thanks to Mr. Robot and some other things that have, pushed it out there. And the number of people that I find running Kali Linux as their daily driver is too damn high. Do not use this unless you are actively penetration testing a company that you work for with express written permission. Moving right along. So Linux distros are whatever people want to make them, meaning they can be anything. And to prove that, I have 2 Linux distributions to show you on one slide. So over here we have Ubuntu Christian Edition, and then we have the direct response to that, Ubuntu Satanic Edition. These were both created by somebody with far too much time on their hands.
The same somebody?
No, different somebodies. But they do kind of illustrate a point that there's some people that get very, very particular about their Linux distro and will try and tell you that you're doing it wrong and say, hey, that's not right and that's not right. Honestly, these two are probably not right. But if you're on one of the ones that we've talked about before this today, with the exception of Kali, then just go with it. Or find one that I didn't talk about that you think is cool. But don't let anyone shame you for using a distro that you like, even me, even if you use Linux Mint or Ubuntu. All right, so this is a quote. Linus Torvalds, I'm interested in Linux because of the technology, and Linux wasn't started as any kind of rebellion against the evil Microsoft empire. This doesn't really touch on what we talked about today too much, except that Linux doesn't have to be a show of rebellion. It stands on its own. It's not because Microsoft is evil, it's because Linux is cool. Get into Linux because you want to, not because you're running away from something. It's really, really a fantastic operating system. I love using it. I love talking about it. I spent way too much time of my life trying to get this conference up and running. So just enjoy it. Just don't turn it into a hateful thing. Be positive about your Linux experience. Remember, there's no one right Linux distribution. This is how you yell at me. Any questions?
It's not a related question, but how much time did it take you to get that email address?
Oh, I was giving a lecture to students about how to register an email address, or how to register a domain, and I typed in Burkeland.com as an example, and this was auto-suggested as an available address to purchase of Berkey.land, and I'm like, class pauses for a moment, please. And then I bought it right then and there, and I'm super proud of it.
So, classroom project.
So what about, are there any other wrong versions of Linux, like say Hannah Montana?
No, if you want to use Hannah Montana Linux, use it. All right.
I missed the Hannah Montana.